Okay, so another hot button topic in the industry right now is like the optimal training bros or whatever. So this is kind of a thing where like you get people, you know, they really like nerd out on biomechanics. There's nothing wrong with that. And they really start turning a lot of exercises into this like kind of complicated setup where, you know, you got to get like a seat, you got to drag a bench over to like the cable machines, and then you got to set up, you know, your cable presses at like some angle. And so there's two aspects of that. On one aspect of that, you know, it's like, okay, well, they're right in a way that like, yeah, those are ways to work the muscles at different angles that may be a little more conducive towards muscle growth. It can smooth out that length tension it can smooth out the length tension curve on some level, you know. But then on the other hand, you know, we have some of these setups that they get fairly complicated at some point, and we kind of run into issues where it's not good for your training economy. And this is kind of like one of the reasons why there's a lot of good training modalities out there, but the problem is that they take so much time to set up and, you know, to execute safely that it may not be worth doing, you know. And this is something that like for me, for example, I love training under band tension. I think training with accommodating resistance is amazing and it's phenomenal for breaking through strength plateaus, you know, boosting strength, boosting muscle mass. To me, it's one of the most underrated training modalities out there, but do I use it all the time? I don't. And that's one of those things that like, well, why wouldn't you use it? Well, depending on where you're training at or the gym you're set up, or in my case, like my training is not always super consistent because, you know, I travel sometimes and it's hard, you know, and that form of training is not always available to me to set up. And then I end up having to make these wild changes to my programming, which overall in the grand scheme of things tends to hurt it more than help it. So that's one of those things like, you know, if your gym doesn't have a great setup to do something like, you know, especially for something like deadlifts, you know, if you don't have a great setup to do like banded deadlifts, for example, or banded squats, you know, and you gotta do this thing where, you know, you gotta drag a million dumbbells over and you gotta like try to anchor these heavy bands down, for example, you know, and that whole process takes you 10, 15 minutes. And it's like, well, you probably would have just had better overall progress if you just didn't use the bands and you just did more regular sets of deadlifts, for example. You know, or you could have used a little bit more complex loading scheme to achieve a similar training effect. So we kind of see that same principle at play with a lot of these more like, you know, trying to optimize every exercise. Especially when we get into stuff where you're just training one limb at a time. And it's like, yeah, like sometimes you can train a muscle better if you just focus on one limb. You can align everything up perfectly with the way the muscle functions. But the problem is that, well, like let's say in the case where you're training arms, for example, and you do like the overhead tricep extension. Well, certainly you could do one tricep, then the other tricep, and you go back and forth, and that's fine. What happens is, if you had just done both arms at the same time, you know, you probably could have spent that same amount of time that you're using training the other arm. You could have done bicep curls instead, you know. So when it comes to like optimizing your program, a lot of it's very much a time management issue as well. So if you find that you're taking a lot of time trying to set up an exercise because you think it's a perfect exercise, you know, you really got to ask yourself, you know, would my time in setting that up and trying to make everything perfect for this one single exercise, would that time have just been better spent doing a simpler exercise that's easier to set up, and I could have paired it with another exercise that was also easy to set up, you know, and I essentially could have doubled my training economy. So keep that in mind, you know, as you're trying to like figure out ways to fine tune your exercises. You know, sometimes simple and convenient is very much the best option to go with, especially if you're working out in a commercial gym and you're limited on time. And you know, this time of year, you know, things are crowded and everyone's, you know, waiting on pieces of equipment. You know, this is kind of the time of year where it's like, hey, you know, doing simple and death by volume is a lot of times better than doing complicated and, you know, trying to go like the minimalist route. So anyways, keep that in mind. That's all I got on like the whole like optimal training thing, and see you guys later.